Welcome to WhiskyCast, cask strength conversation featuring news and interviews from the world of whiskey. I'm Mark Gillespie. This is episode number 684 for March 11th, 2018. This weekend I'm in Waco, Texas for the Rye Fest at Balcones Distilling. Coming up in a few minutes.
Looking back now, I should have put more whiskey down. That's probably my biggest regret, biggest impediment is we don't have enough stock. But it was a great, really enjoyable industry in Australia. Everybody's very collegiate, everybody helps each other, and I think from that point of view, it's fun, really, it's that fun job.
When you think of Australian whiskies, Tasmania is usually the first place that comes to mind. But there are whiskies being made all over Australia. Cameron Syme founded the Great Southern Distilling Company in Western Australia back in 2005 and released his first Lime Burners single malt whiskey 3 years later. He's one of several Australian distillers who made the long journey to New York City for Whiskey Live last week, and we'll hear from them later on WhiskyCast In-Depth. I'll also talk with Balcones head distiller Jared Himstedt about his newest whiskeys, the first ever rye whiskeys from Balcones. We'll also have the calendar of events, your voice, and the What I'm Tasting This Week department, all just ahead on this week's WhiskyCast from Waco.
WhiskyCast, brought to you by Redbreast, the definitive single pot still Irish whiskey. Those in the know Redbreast.
You don't need a special occasion to celebrate with something truly unique. But a personally engraved bottle of Johnnie Walker Blue Label can make any occasion special. Support for WhiskyCast comes from Johnnie Walker. Visit johnniewalker.com to find out more about engraving options near you.
Let's get started with the week's news. It's brought to you by Highland Park. As expected, U.S. President Donald Trump signed an executive order Thursday imposing punitive tariffs on imports of steel and aluminum. And it also sets the stage for the European Union to retaliate with tariffs on bourbon whiskey and other American-made products that are produced in politically sensitive areas. A final announcement on those sanctions has not come yet from Brussels as we're recording this week's episode, so we don't yet know just how far the European Union is willing to go with those sanctions. For instance, if Brussels limits the sanctions to bourbon whiskey only, instead of going after all American whiskeys, that could make a big difference. Brown-Forman CEO Paul Varga told analysts this week that his company could be, quote, an unfortunate victim of a trade war. But keep in mind, its best-selling whiskey is Jack Daniel's, and that's labeled as a Tennessee whiskey, not as a bourbon. So if the EU only imposes tariffs on bourbons, Jack Daniel's could likely escape those tariffs. We'll keep you posted on developments as they happen. In other news, Diageo is making some big changes at its distillery in Tullahoma, Tennessee. It'll no longer be known as the George Dickel Distillery. While the distillery will continue to make George Dickel Tennessee whiskey, it's been renamed the Cascade Hollow Distilling Company, and Nicole Austin has been named general manager and head distiller. She started out as a blender at Kings County Distillery in Brooklyn, New York, then went on to work for Dave Pickerell's Oakview consulting firm, before moving over to Ireland to work on the Tullamore Dew Distillery for William Grant & Sons. By the way, the Cascade Hollow name revives a bit of the Tullahoma area's original distilling history. While the current distillery did not open until 1964, the original Cascade Distillery was located just down the road and operated from the 1870s until 1910, when Tennessee went dry during the early stages of Prohibition. One more update out of Tennessee now. Last time around, I reported that Brown-Forman and other distillers are fighting a Moore County tax assessor's attempt to declare the barrels used in maturing their whiskey as taxable property instead of non-taxable product inventory. Tennessee's Attorney General has now issued an opinion siding with the tax assessor. The Chattanooga Times Free Press reports Herbert Slattery's opinion concludes whiskey barrels are not, quote, manufactured items because they're not converted into different items. The Tennessee Distillers Guild argues that the barrels are converted just as much by maturing whiskey as the liquid is inside those barrels, and that taxing barrels could drive some craft distillers out of business. State lawmakers are considering a proposal to declare barrels as non-taxable. It's estimated Brown-Forman could be hit with an annual tax bill of around $2.8 million for its barrels at Jack Daniel's alone. Last month, I reported that Alltech founder Dr. Pierce Lyons had been hospitalized in Lexington, Kentucky. Sadly, the man who created the Town Branch Distillery in Lexington and the new distillery in Dublin, Ireland that bears his name, the Pierce Lyons Distillery, passed away on Thursday following complications from heart surgery back in November. Funeral services are planned for this coming Saturday in Lexington, and a memorial service will be held next month in Dublin. His son, Mark Lyons, has been named chairman and president of the family-owned agribusiness company. Dr. Lyons was 73 years old. Our condolences go out to his family and colleagues. Let's talk about new whiskeys now. Compass Box has created a limited edition version of its classic Hedonism blended grain Scotch whiskey, which was the first whiskey John Glaser created nearly 17 years ago at Compass Box. Hedonism the Muse uses grain whiskies from 4 different distilleries in Scotland, ranging in age from 17 to 43 years old. It'll be available worldwide starting this month, and I'll have my tasting notes for it in just a few minutes. White & Mackay unveiled a complete revamping of its Jura single malts this week. The only carryover is the Jura 10-year-old, which was launched last year in the U.S. The no-age statement Jura Journey is the flagship of the new Signature Series range. There will also be new 12 and 18-year-old editions, along with the 7-wood, a single malt matured in ex-bourbon barrels, then finished in 6 different types of French oak wine casks. Jura's Daryl Haldane says the whiskeys are creating a new house style for the distillery.
The community on Jura is around 200, so the distillery plays a key role, not only as an employer, but I think also as a sort of flag of the island. You know, you've got 8,000 roughly guests that come just to visit the distillery every year, and what we really think is that to give this brand a great opportunity to continue to grow, to be consumed by more people. I think it's all good news. I think it's a real commitment, actually, and a real confidence that Jura is alive and well. And actually, I think this will allow us to get more different types of whiskey drinkers enjoying the brand. So we know that the real whiskey enthusiasts, some of the stories that they love around peat, around wood types and all that kind of stuff. There's products in this range which will definitely be of interest to these guys. But also, I think Jura has because of the style of whiskey and because of the story, I think as well, it is a great opportunity for bringing new people into whiskey.
The new whiskies will replace the existing Jura Origin, Superstition, Prophecy, and the 16-year-old Jurox Own, with availability varying by country. Most markets will get the Jura Journey, while the U.S. will continue to get the 10-year-old, along with the 7-wood and 18-year-old editions. Ben Riach is out with the second batch of its triple cask strength single malt. This batch uses a range of Oloroso sherry casks, bourbon barrels, and virgin oak hogsheads, all filled between 2006 and 2008. It's bottled at 60.6% ABV and will be available at whiskey shops worldwide. There's no word on pricing. Sweden's Box Distillery has released the second bottling in its Kärkus series. Kärkus 2 Alba comes from whiskey matured for between 4 and 5 years in ex-bourbon barrels, then transferred to smaller virgin oak casks. It's a follow-up to last year's Kärkus 1 Rober, which was made with whiskeys matured in European oak casks. Australia's Sullivan's Cove is releasing its first cask-strength single cask bottling in many years. It's an 11-year-old single malt matured in an ex-bourbon barrel and bottled at 69.1% ABV. It's available only in Australia through the distillery's online shop. The price is $400 Australian, At today's exchange rates, that's $314 US. And Beam Suntory is releasing the first 2018 batch of Booker's Bourbon. This edition is named Kathleen's Batch in honor of longtime Beam Suntory executive Kathleen DiBenedetto, who worked with Booker many years ago to create the small batch collection. That work helped earn her a place in the Kentucky Bourbon Hall of Fame back in 2015. Kathleen worked with Fred No and his round-table team of tasters to pick the whiskey for this edition. It's bottled at 63.7% ABV and will be available in the U.S. for around $70 a bottle. You've heard a lot about women in the whiskey world the last couple of weeks, both here on WhiskyCast and on social media. Becky Paskin of ScotchWhiskey.com and Dewar's Global Malts Ambassador Georgie Bell have created a new social media campaign to highlight diversity in the whiskey industry. Their hashtag Our Whiskey campaign kicked off this week.
The idea is we really want to tackle why there's not enough diversity within whiskey marketing in terms of the faces that are portrayed. When you look at the traditional marketing campaigns from a lot of whiskey brands, they tend to be very male-oriented with a certain age range as well. And a lot of brands do tend to talk quite a lot about wanting to appeal to a female whiskey market. But that's not really something that we wanted to do with this campaign. What we want to do is really represent the face of the modern whiskey drinker, whether that's, a woman who goes out and drinks whiskey with her friends, or whether that's a guy who drinks whiskey with his friends, or a group of guys and girls that get together to drink whiskey together, meet on the rocks in cocktails, however that is. Whiskey, we find, is a spirit with really broad appeal. So, but that broad appeal doesn't really come across in whiskey marketing, and we felt there was a huge gap in the market that just really wasn't being addressed by the big brands. It just felt like a no-brainer, quite honestly, and something that if they weren't going to do, then we needed to do it instead.
And what we also found, Mark, is that actually, if you look internally, a lot of main people that are involved in whiskey are actually women. And from an internal standpoint, there's actually quite a nice balance and gender diversity. If you look across Scotland, there are master blenders, master distillers, brand ambassadors, global marketing managers, local marketing managers. They're all women that are really championing the way, all the way actually through to sort of senior editors and editors of very well-respected whiskey magazines. And so we thought, right, well, if we can showcase that actually from an inside out, at a very early stage, that whiskey is diverse. We're not going back into history. We know that historically, we talk about some fundamental women that have been involved in whiskey, but we want to talk about today and we want to talk about the future. And that's the most important thing for us.
While Georgie does work for Dewar's, the Our Whiskey campaign is brand neutral. And while the initial launch is focusing on women and their role in the industry, the campaign will also include different ethnic groups and cultures worldwide going forward. You can find out more on social media by searching for the hashtag Our Whiskey. And here's another note on that changing diversity. Sam Simmons, the longtime global brand ambassador for the Balvenie, has turned in his sample case. He's left William Grant & Sons to join Adam Brands, the parent company of Master of Malt and Maverick Drinks, as its director of whiskey.
It was not an easy decision, I assure you. I mean, I've been really fortunate to work with such an amazing company full of amazing people, and at the distillery, and all the people I've met in the field and that work for Grants around the world, and the ambassadors who you've met and that we've assembled all over during my time here. It's not an easy thing to walk away from. And then David, of course, working with David Stewart over a period that he was dedicated to just Balvenie, over that period where he created Caribbean Cask and scaled it up, and to create double with 17-year-old, and extending the range to include the single barrels of 3 different cask types and 3 different ages, and all these things that I was involved in and really proud of when we were there. And Ton, obviously, 1401 and 1858 and 1509, and then DCS Compendium. And over this whole period, being able to work with David Stewart while he became MBE and while he did all these amazing things with whiskey was such an honor and such an awesome thing to be a part of. No, not easy to walk away. But yeah, it does, I guess, some comfort knowing that, someone else will have the opportunity to also say they had the blessing to work with David C. Stewart, MBE, in the twilight of his career. So that gives me some comfort. But yeah, I needed to travel less. I have a young family, and a new challenge was probably due. So those are part of the motivators.
So who's taking over for you on the Balvenie?
Well, that was not an easy process either. I mean, we have so many amazing people at the distillery who were probably interested in the role, and then we have a whole team of ambassadors that we've assembled over my time there on Balvenie, but also, across all the brands with 1 Million Grant Sums. We did keep the search internal, and at the end of the day, the Balvenie team decided to go with Gemma Patterson, and Gemma's worked in the U.S. for us for a couple of years, and we moved her over from the distillery where she started, and she was working, hosting people at the distillery and really making an impact on people. I know, traveling the world, people from all over the world obviously visit the distillery, and not all of them can get around Balvenie because you have to book ahead, and there's only really 16 openings per day. And Gemma really made a name for herself in going above and beyond to get people around the distillery. And so she really warmed everyone's hearts around the world at that point. And then also what she's done in the States since she's been there has been astonishing. I think none of my colleagues would disagree. She is a real loss to them, but an asset to Balvenie going forward.
And we'd like to extend our congratulations to Gemma. You can hear my recent conversation with her during a tasting of the latest DCS Compendium batch in the WhiskyCast In-Depth section at whiskycast.com. That's also where you can keep up on the latest whiskey news all week long. The news is brought to you by Highland Park. The days are starting to get a bit longer now, but that does not mean you can't enjoy the dark. The latest single malt from Highland Park, the Orkney Single Malt with Viking Soul. Get the details at highlandparkwhiskey.com.
You don't need a special occasion to open a bottle of Johnnie Walker Blue Label. But when you have a special occasion, why not celebrate with a specially engraved bottle of Johnnie Walker Blue Label? Here's how one whiskey lover celebrated his team's recent success. He arranged to have 108 specially engraved bottles of Johnnie Walker Blue Label made for his co-workers. You might say he hit a home run. Just like a perfectly executed double play, Johnnie Walker Blue Label is smooth and well-rounded, and unlike a trophy, never needs polishing. Support for WhiskyCast comes from Johnnie Walker. Visit johnniewalker.com to find out more about engraving options near you.
Johnnie Walker Blue Label Blended Scotch Whiskey, 40% alcohol by volume. Imported by Diageo North America, Norwalk, Connecticut. Please drink responsibly.
Once again, this weekend, we're at the Balcones Rye Fest at Balcones Distilling in Waco, Texas. I'm sitting here with Balcones head distiller Jared Himstedt. Jared, thanks for having us here this weekend.
Yeah, absolutely. Glad to have you.
Let's talk about these new rye whiskeys. This is the first time you've done a rye whiskey, isn't it?
Yeah, it's the first time we've released it. We've been working on it for just shy of 4 years or so. Kind of stressed on and off when we were done, and reblended and finally felt pretty happy with it. And decided we'd probably time to share it. So. Yeah.
Now, this is a bit unusual. It's a straight rye whiskey, 100% rye, but you used 4 different types of rye grains in this, didn't you? Tell me about them.
Just the grain world has changed so much. Things that used to be only available in malt varieties, now you can get, midnight wheat, caramel rye, things like that weren't available. As soon as we decided we were going to play with it, there were so many fun options on what to use and play with. We probably did a good 8 or 10 iterations. We landed in what I'm calling the recipe we currently have, which isn't completely, we're still playing with it a little bit, but you did a couple different controls with base ones, some flakes, some raw, some local, some not, different percentages of the specialty stuff to kind of hone in on what we were really enjoying about it, so yeah.
Now, there are 2 versions of this, the 100 proof base version that will be available outside of the distillery, and then the cask strength version that you're only going to have here at the distillery. You don't have a whole lot of that one, do you?
No, not a whole lot yet. I mean, that literally is barrels from the very first round of R&D, so there's not a whole lot of that. I think the bottling was a little bit under 550 bottles of that. And of course, because it's straight, I can't even fix that probably next year to get that volume up. But there'll be more of it eventually. And it'll get to go out past the distillery, but
Where will the 100 proof rye be available? Pretty much just in Texas, a little bit out of it coming out?
The first bottling is just going to mostly hit Texas, but it'll be a regularly available product, so probably when we get to maybe early Q3, get some into other markets that we're doing okay, like Florida, California, New York, Chicago, places like that, a little bit to the UK. So,
what else are you guys working on these days? We haven't had a chance to really congratulate you on the World Whiskies Award last week that came out for the best single cask American single malt with the that 38-year-old or 38-month-old French oak version from last year.
Yep.
But what else are you guys working on?
We've got a high rye bourbon and a wheater in the mix, which we've never played a lot with multi-grain mash bills, but we figured it'd be a shame not to at least try and see if we got onto something promising. Some of our refill, second fill bourbon barrel malt and stuff like that we've always used as a component in putting the one together. We're probably going to release some of that by itself. Me and Zach both, the blending team and distilling team, we've always really enjoyed those refill barrels and just never put that as an expression. The peated Golden Promise, which we had to custom order from the Simpson. That's even the barrel that we pulled out yesterday. That's it's just straight now. I don't know exactly when that's going to come out this year, and once again, it'll be a small 3 to 4 barrel bottling probably. But that's probably one of the most likely, other than the rye, to become a regular offering. We've laid down a decent amount the last few years.
Now, the last time I was here in June of last year, you were still working on the expansion in the still house with 2 new stills.
Yeah.
You've got that complete now. What does that give you the flexibility to do here? Because you're now able to make more types of whiskey at the same time, right?
Right. And both the wash stills and the 2 spirit stills have some different geometry and dimensions. So the physics there, reflux, there's a lot of things that are affected. The second spirit still we intentionally made the coil on the line arm is 8-inch diameter, so we upped the diameter from 6 to 8. We took a few rounds of coils out. We were intentionally trying to see if we could bump over a little more meaty, oily, kind of mess with the texture and the mouthfeel a little bit, with the assumption that malt probably is going to slowly be migrating off to that one, or maybe a percentage from each. But especially with doing American styles, it's kind of fun to see. We don't make everything all the time, but even the part of year this year when we get to rum, to see how they behave on different ones and be able to kind of slowly start tweaking what really shines on the different still sets depending on what we can get from them. So.
And we should explain the reason for those coils on the top and the line arm. It's to replicate what you guys had at the old distillery a few blocks south of here.
They were pretty long, and they had like a real slow incline over compared to the volume, a pretty long distance. And so, we were trying to keep as much of that character similar, even though you're, obviously with a much bigger space.
And to scale that up, you would have had to stretch those line arms out a couple hundred yards almost to make it work.
Yeah, I think I said this last time, but Richard Forsyth was like, you guys are going to have to look at property a few blocks away before we can put the condensers where they need to go. It's like, well, I think we can come up with a better idea than that. But.
Well, speaking of property a few blocks away, in this case a few miles away, you're no longer storing all of your stuff for maturation here in the old fireproof storage building, are you?
No, we maxed out here right at the end of the year. Actually, with the new warehouses that got built outside of town, before we were done with those and could start moving stuff in, I mean, we had barrels everywhere. They're just like under desks. I mean, we were so beyond packed out, needing those things to be ready. But it'll be a while before they're full. It'll probably be a good 2.5 years before they're full. But almost 90% of the storage is going to be out there. So we'll keep some special stuff here, or like extra older barrels we want to be able to check on more easily and quicker. It'll be fun to see how that. I feel like the whole thing has just been a decade of just kind of trying things, sometimes ignorantly, sometimes with good information. Slowly over the years, you make better decisions, you waste less time, but it feels like a lot of discovery. So I'm excited to see what that height, metal buildings, a little bit further out of town, more ventilation. It'll be interesting to see how that relates to here. And once again, get to spend the next 10 years finding out where the things we make, where they want to live, where they're happiest, in that new environment. So.
And you're celebrating your 10th anniversary this year in the new building after moving up from the old distillery under the bridge about 6-7 blocks south of here. Any thoughts yet on what you might do with that old building?
No, it's a bummer because it'd be fun to do R&D down there, but when I start looking at the man hours and the labor just to get like 1 or 2 barrels when you can do 10 or 20 a day and much more control over the parameters, it's not really research down there. It's kind of like they could run very different on any given day. So I don't know. There's been talk about doing beer stuff down there, or doing kind of some little pop-up dinner whiskey tastings, secret, nobody knows where it is kind of thing. So I don't know. Right now it's a rat and possum sanctuary currently, I think, but maybe some spiders too.
You can see that old distillery in the WhiskyCast HD episode we did with Jared this time last year. Is this going to become an annual event, RyeFest?
I don't know. That definitely wasn't the intent. We do like having events where we got music and stuff, and it can really be this isn't a hard, this is about whiskey. Like, let's just get people together and have a good time. I'm always jealous, Smooth Ambler's done a really good job of having some really cool Blue Cast festivals and things over the years, and I'm always jealous because it never works out timing-wise, but it's not about whiskey. Whiskey's great, and we all love it, but, it's all just like good conversation, good music, good food. It's all, just part of a well-lived life, and so I really have fun when we get to do these things, and it's not a hard sell. It's not the focal point. That's a catalyst to get some people together because there's a whiskey coming out. But we usually do have some people that show up for these things, and they don't even stay. They're in line to get the special release, and they're going to be here 30 minutes to get their bottle and take off.
And that takes all the fun out of it.
They can stay. The rest of us get to stay and enjoy some food and listen to some music, and couldn't have had a better day. Weather's fantastic. So.
And since this is radio, we're sitting under a live oak tree right now, just outside the distillery. It's going to be about 84 degrees here in Waco today. The sun is shining. We may have some clouds later today. You couldn't have a better day for
Moderate
this.
breeze, yeah. No, it's going to be solid.
Well, thank you again for having us again down here, and congratulations on the new rye and the whiskey award last week. And we'll have the tasting notes for the rye coming up here in a few minutes on WhiskyCast. Thanks again for joining us, Jared Himstedt, the head distiller here at Balcones Distilling.
Thank you, Martin.
Let's open up the inbox now for this week's Your Voice, brought to you by Lot 40. Last time around, I asked you to share some of the things about whiskey that really set you off on a rant. And man, did a lot of you vent. We had more than 100 comments on Facebook and Twitter from around the world, a lot more than I could share in this segment. But here are just a few of them. And since I'm in Texas this weekend, we'll start with this one from Ashley Hamilton. Honesty. I'm from Texas, and most of the whiskeys aren't even made here. Their packagers try to play up the Texas marketing and branding and lie right to your face about their product and where it's distilled. Just be honest, and it will get you further with the consumer. It also makes it 10 times harder for the honest distillers who make their own products in the marketplace. Thank you, Ashley. Here's a comment now from Neil Murphy. Bad social media advertising from the industry itself infuriates me. Fed up seeing pics of rich white guys in expensive suits, flashy cars, and Rolex watches holding a bottle. It's 2018. Stop with the sexist, elitist bullshit, please. Scott Wooler posted this note from Australia. Posts on pages accessed globally, but which some assume everyone is from the one country. A dollar sign ain't a dollar sign when there are 13 countries with their own dollar sign. Good point, Scott. And for the record, unless we specify another country's currency, the prices we mention in our news stories on WhiskyCast and on our website are listed in U.S. dollars. But once again, that's a really good point, Scott. Now, I agree with this post from Ashley Penny in Ireland. Those who like whiskey but ignore blends. They would believe single malts are the biz, but say blends are inferior. There are some fine single malts and blends that deserve just as much praise as any. That's the joy of having an interest. The palate of each and every one of us is different, which makes it so wonderful. Well said, Ashley. From Jill Ann Stoley-Mark in Maryland now, elitism in all of its forms. The constant need of some fanciers to make others feel lesser than for their personal taste, means of enjoyment, attitudes on present-day debates, age statements, for example. There's just no need for it. A rising tide lifts all boats. Share information without shaming. We all get wiser together. Amen to that. From Ross Salkow, the line that, quote, bourbon only comes from bourbon country. And we'll end with this one from my oldest daughter, Brianna Gillespie. Whiskey bros who can't fathom that a woman could drink whiskey, enjoy it, and have an opinion about it. It's not a pickup line. Great point, Bree. And thank you to everyone who shared their pet peeves about whiskey with us this week. If you have something you'd like to share with whiskey lovers around the world, you can always post it on the Your Voice page at whiskycast.com. Of course, we're also on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and Tumblr at WhiskyCast. And my email address is comments@whiskycast.com. This week's Your Voice is brought to you by Lot 40, Canada's award-winning 100% pot still rye whiskey. Lot 40, unapologetically Canadian. Please drink responsibly. Time now for the WhiskyCast calendar of events. The Balvenie is hosting a whiskey and chocolate tasting session at the Coach and Horses Q in London this coming Friday, March 16th. The Midlands Whiskey Festival is the 16th and 17th in Stourbridge, England. Woodford Reserve is hosting an Ode to the Irish dinner on the 17th at the distillery in Versailles, Kentucky. Starward Distillery in Melbourne, Australia hosts the Whiskey Social March 21st. Binny's in Lincoln Park, Illinois hosts Bourbon Women Night on the 21st, followed by the annual World of Whiskies tasting on the 22nd. That's the night before Whiskey Fest Chicago on the 23rd. I'll be in Cornwall, Ontario that weekend for the Wonderful World of Whiskey show on the 23rd and 24th. Whiskies of the World San Francisco is on the 24th, and the Jack Rose Dining Saloon in Washington, D.C. hosts Premier Drams 2018 on March 25th. Those are just a few of the 200-plus different whiskey events on our searchable calendar at whiskycast.com. If you have a festival or a tasting coming up, just use the contact form on our website and let us know all about it.
Redbreast fans have always cherished our whiskey's sherry notes, so we set out to embellish that character. Introducing the Redbreast Listowel edition, a quintessential single pot still Irish whiskey finished in first fill Oloroso sherry casks from Spain's prestigious Bodegas Listowel. Carrying Redbreast's trademark pot still spices and dark dried fruit notes, the Listowel edition is graced with an enduring sherry finish that would be better described as a final act. Discover the newest branch on the Redbreast family tree.
WhiskyCast In-Depth is brought to you by Lagavulin. Australia's whiskey industry is growing quickly, and while most of the focus has been on Tasmania for many years, there are distilleries all over the country. Until now, only a few distillers exported their whiskies outside of Australia, most notably Tasmania's Sullivan's Cove and Lark, with a few others here and there. Now we are starting to see more exports from down under as the whiskey industry matures in Australia. Cameron Syme founded the Great Southern Distilling Company in 2005 and built a second distillery 10 years later. His Lime Burners single malts are starting to attract international attention.
Jim Murray this year gave us best whiskey in the Southern Hemisphere for our darkest winter. And in fact, he said this distillery has single-handedly put Western Australia on the map as one of the world's great whiskey-making regions. So I think we're slowly chipping away at creating a good name for it. And I think our whiskies are doing phenomenally well.
Tell me about the reasons for opening the distillery in the first place. What got you guys interested in doing whiskey?
I always liked whiskey. So I didn't like beer and wine. And in the 1980s, when I was a younger person, whiskey for me was what it was all about. So I'd always wanted to open a distillery. And in 2004, we signed the contract for the stills. And 2005, we did our first distillations. So we've been going for 14 years, 15 years of making whiskey. It's been a lot of good fun.
Tell me about those early years starting up, though. Were there times when you thought you might not make it?
Oh, absolutely. And particularly when they had the global financial crisis, that was always very tough. Looking back now, I should have put more whiskey down. That's probably my biggest regret, biggest impediment is we don't have enough stock. But it was a great, really enjoyable industry in Australia. Everybody's very collegiate. Everybody helps each other. And I think from that point of view, it's fun, really. It's that fun job.
Give me some idea of how hard it was to get into the United States market, because we've talked with a lot of distillers from around the world who try to enter this market, and it's not easy, is it?
It's not. It's, I'd say, crazy almost. We export to 6 countries, and the US has been the toughest in terms of the regulations, even changes to label. When we first put our labels in for approval, they said we couldn't use the term single malt whiskey. I was like, hold on, that's exactly what it is, but we couldn't get approval for single malt. So we then had to change the labels specifically just for the US market. It's been a real nightmare.
So what did you change it to?
We managed to get a different bureaucrat, Mark, who finally approved a single malt, but we couldn't put on their sherry or port cask finish, because once we said it was either finished in a sherry or a port barrel, that was what they didn't like. So we've finally got single malt, but we had to give up the sherry or the port. It's an odd arrangement.
And how hard was it to get an importer and get distribution and all that? You're still working all that out, right?
We're about to sign with Priest Imports, so we've been working with them. Great people to work with, and I think once that's we've got whiskey on pallets in Australia ready to come to the US, so I'd expect we'll have it here on the ship within 3 weeks and then here.
What is your ultimate goal with the distillery?
Pass it on to my children. That's been from the very beginning, was to create a business that then my children could take over. And I've got 3 children and they seem very keen. They're too young, sort of 16, 12 and 10, but they're very keen to take the business on. From my point of view, I think that's a success.
I'll have my tasting notes for the Lime Burner's Darkest Winter in just a few minutes. Now, South Australia is known primarily for its wines, and when John Rochefort opened up the McLaren Vale Distillery in Blewett Springs a couple of years ago, he wanted to build off of the region's wine heritage while his own spirit is maturing. So, he came up with the Pilot Project.
I wanted to showcase the most famous wine regions in Australia through a collection of whiskies. So I approached 20 different vineyards from Australia, the 20 most famous that we knew, and asked them to basically give us access to their entire collections of wines. So what I did, those 20 vineyards each had to provide me with 20 casks that showcased their history. So for instance, we'll talk about cask number 1, Hardy's. In 1890, 12 brandy casks were sent from France, Bordeaux, 25-year-old brandies to Australia, with 400,000 two-bud spurs, which were the muscat vines in Bordeaux. They were sent with the original brandy cask into Australia in 1890. In 1890, they planted all that original muscat, and in 1915, they believed it was good enough and old enough to harvest for the first time. Those brandy casks were then a 50-year-old brandy. Hardy's believed the best muskets in the world came from ex-brandy casks. So that first ever harvest, they emptied out all of the original brandies, which were then 50 years old, and filled them with the first ever harvest of Hardy's muskets in Australia. That went through until 2015, to the day, 100 years after it was first filled. We then took, and this is where the Pilot Project comes into it, I asked 8 distilleries from around the world to share with me what they regarded as the best spirit they'd ever made, or the best whiskies they'd ever made. So from Journeyman in the US, Akeshi Distillery in Japan, Lark in Tasmania, Lime Burners from Western Australia, Alchemia in the United Kingdom, myself and another one called Kraftwerk in New South Wales, they all sent me 20 litres. 200 mils of each of their 20 litres got put into the Pilot Project, which is out there on the display stand to showcase day one, before it went to a barrel. I then blended them all together, all 8 distilleries, and filled that 150-year-old brandy muscat cask with the Pilot Project. Every year I'm going to come back to New York with 1 bottle only, which is a progress report each year of how it's developing. So what happens with it, each year the glass artist is blowing a new vessel, and that's going to showcase the individual characteristics and the character of each distillery that was part of the project. So in 10 years' time, when it's finished maturation, all of those bottles will be filled with the finished product, and they'll come and they'll all be displayed together. Whatever's left in that cask at the end of maturation will be bottled and it'll be available to the public, and that's the Pilot Project.
Very cool idea. How did you get everybody to cooperate?
I said, "G'day guys, this is what I want to do. Can you send me some spirit?" And they all went, "Yep." No questions asked. No one asked for any money. They all sent it. It cost Akeshi Distillery $10,000 to send it. I'm so fortunate. I really have been blessed in this industry. And the thing I loved about it is everyone that I've always worked with, particularly Bill Lark, where I started making whiskey with Bill, he's always been so helpful and bending over backwards to get people started in Australia. And I think it's an attitude the rest of the world, particularly in the craft industry, shares, that support to be able to help each other through. I mean, it's rare I can't talk to any distillery. I pick up the phone, we can have chats about yeast strains and what they're using and their aging and their timing and everything, and true trade secrets we share on a daily basis. And I'm a big believer that if we share that information, we can all get better. And the better the industry can be and the better the product is, the entire tide's going to rise all the boats.
Now tell me about the whiskey you're making. It's 2 years old this year, right?
Yeah, correct, yeah. So our whiskies themselves, the Bloodstone collection showcases 400 different casks. So every time you're looking at a bottle, there'll be number 1 on the front if it's Hardy's, and there'll be 20 chapters underneath it. There's also Maxwell's, Yalumba, Chalk Hill, Chapel Hill, Hedonism, Hugh Hamilton, Richard Hamilton, Dutchkeys, Darrenberg, Seaview Wines, Petaluma, Petteringa, K1, the list goes on. There's 20 vineyards in the collection. So in total there's 400 different single cask, single malts, and they showcase the entire history of those vineyards, from the very first barrels they ever put down to the wines they're making today. So if you wanted to see Hardy's wines, the entire history of Hardy's wine in a whiskey, you can buy the Hardy's whiskey collection that we make at the Bloodstone. So that's what we do. Our distillery's located right in the heart of McLaren Vale, so one of the 2 most famous wine regions in Australia. With the distillery right in the middle of it and a bond store right beside me, I can watch them empty out those casks, and this is why it's so important for me. I want to be able to showcase the real flavours of those wines in those casks, not something that's spent 3 months at sea being shipped from Spain or France or Portugal that's going to go bitter and sour and lose those key flavours. So if I can have them empty it, I'm there with them. I put it straight in the back of my car, one by one I do this, and we take the barrel to the cooperage who's waiting for us. As soon as we get there, they'll take the head off. There's no need to shave that cask, it's immaculate, it's in perfect condition. So we basically do a toasting char first to dry the wood with a blue flame. Once the wood's dry, then we go into the char. We then put it back together, and in 5 minutes later, I'm back at the distillery, and we'll have that day's spirit run finishing as the cask's arriving. So we'll fill into a hot, wet cask. There's no need to fill it with water to soak it. So that full history, the 150 years worth of background flavours, are undamaged, and we go straight into the cask. Obviously, the fluctuation of temperature we have there. I'm on the southern tip of the Mount Lofty Ranges, so we get all the cold breezes and the misty fogs coming in at night time, which really drop the temperature down to around that 5-degree mark. But during the day, South Australian sun, we're up to 30, 35, 40-degree days, so we've got huge movement of wood. So for these, even at 2 years old, as people say, they're really showcasing things that are far beyond their age. The one you're actually tasting now is only 130 days old. And this is the thing, the ones I'm showcasing out on the table at the moment, I think the oldest one I've got out on the table there is about 210 days, and I've had constant comments so far saying it's the best whiskey we've tried here tonight. So it's at 63.5 cask strength. I never water them down. I don't think it's my right to water down a whiskey, particularly with that much history. I'm not saying you shouldn't do it. I just think it's like saying this is the best piece of Belgian chocolate in the world. Try it in that milkshake. And I was like, give me the chocolate. So all of my whiskies I'll always bottle at cask strength. I'll also sell it with the original bottle of fortified that came out of that cask. So if you buy the Series 1, Chapter 1 Hardy's Muscat whiskey, you'll get the original 100-year-old muscat with it. You'll also get a bottle of our spring water as well. I want you to be able to use the right water when you're watering down your whiskey, so not another sorts of water as well.
When will these go on sale and where? In Australia only or worldwide? What's the plan?
They are selling worldwide. We're going to 35 different countries at the moment. We've literally come to America to bring the first bottles into the States, so it's something that's actually being organised today and tomorrow, the very first distribution of our product into the US. So I'm pretty excited at the moment, yeah.
Is this the realization of your dream?
Absolutely. All I ever wanted to do, I was an ex-chef, and what I loved about being a chef was finding amazing ingredients. I loved being able to present a dish on a plate as well, and to be able to watch someone's face when they would taste that food for the first time and get that joy. For me, the more I started understanding whiskey, and it's all I ever drank. I never drank wine or drank beer, it's always whiskey. The more I started understanding the sciences of chefing, the more I sort of got an understanding of yeast and how it behaves, and all of a sudden the more interest I had in whiskey, and I had to leave chefing and start making whiskey. And the thing I love about whiskey is, again, I take all these ingredients, I can work with them, put them together, change the way they behave depending on whether I'm using a wooden fermenter or what yeast strain I'm using, and I look at it like a barrel's one part of the ingredient, the grain's another part, the climate's another influence, whether I'm cooking in the oven or an open pan, all of those changes. And then I'm presenting it in a dish, which is the design of the bottle. And the great thing is you've got to wait 5 years or 10 years to see someone taste it. Unlike chefing, it was instant. They saw, you'd cook the dish, you'd serve it, and you'd hear at the end of the meal, oh, we love the dish. With whiskey, you've got all that year to wait to see if you pulled off the recipe. And now that we're here and the whiskies are like they are, I'm thrilled. It's everything I could have asked for.
I mentioned this briefly on last week's episode, but John Rochefort was the victim of a thief the other night during Whiskey Live New York. While he was talking with someone and was a bit distracted, another person walked up and grabbed one of his Bloodstone bottles off the table and took off with it. I really hope the person who did that is not a WhiskyCast listener, but if you are, you really should be ashamed of yourself. Moving on now, Craig Field is better known as Crafty and lives in Capertee, New South Wales. He set up Kraftwerk Distillery as an independent bottler, but couldn't resist getting into distilling himself.
I've been distilling now for 3 weeks. That's it. 3 weeks. I've got a 970 litre still, full copper pot still. I'm producing for single malt whiskey. What I'm working on is on very small scale. So looking for a point of difference in spirit. So my single malt whiskey, I'm exploring the different malts, and I've got a real focus on specialty malts, base malts and specialty malts, and I'm trying to get a rich whiskey that's got a raisiny note to it with a bit of chocolate. That's what I'm chasing.
3 weeks probably makes you Australia's newest distiller.
Might change next week. They're fast and furious in Australia now.
Why did you decide to get into making whiskey yourself when you could have just kept on bottling independent stuff?
That's a really good question. With the independent bottling, it started as a single project, just one barrel. I just wanted to do one barrel. And I loved it so much, and I loved being part of a new industry. You know, it's a really passionate industry in Australia. So from there, I continued to do independent bottlings and putting down various types of casks, rum casks, sherry casks, port casks, Shiraz casks, exploring the gamut that's out there in casks. Then I thought, well, I need more control in my flavour profile development. So the way to do that, obviously, is to do my own distillation. So what I'm doing, I'm working with a microbrewer locally. Now they're making my wash for me as per my spec, and it's a journey. It's an absolute journey, and that's what my logo is all about. It's a journey. It's a road, and I'm on a journey.
I guess I have to ask, you kind of got caught up in the whole Nant fiasco, didn't you?
Yes, I did.
What happened?
Well, it's interesting because for me, with Nant, I was looking at acquiring the product as an independent bottler and releasing it under Kraftwerk's whiskey brand. Now, there was rumours at the time that there was things not quite right with Nant in Australia, but I wasn't overly concerned because I thought, well, if the company folds, I can at least get the product, that's what I wanted. My barrels were never filled. So I had two 200-litre barrels, and they were never filled. They never existed. And numerous correspondence with Nant, reassurances that everything's all right. It wasn't. And a lot of people have been burned. There's something like 1,500 barrels don't exist. And there's a lot of angry barrel investors. And even now, years on, it's a blight on the Australian industry.
That was my next question. Is this going to set Australian whiskey back, just having this happen?
I'd say what it's done is it's unnerved a lot of people in the sense of barrel investments. So barrel investments is a tool that people use for funding, to fund their distilleries, startups. There are people struggling now that they're trying to do barrel investments, but there's not the demand there because people have been burned. So yes, it has hurt the industry.
When do you think you'll bottle your spirit, since it's only 3 weeks old right now?
Well, I'd say based on the flavour profile that I've got now and based on the caskings that I want to do in the future, I'm going to be somewhere between probably 2.5 to 4 years for my first release.
And you'll be back here in New York then, right?
Absolutely. This is the first time I've been to New York. I arrived on Monday, I fly out on Saturday. I love it. I love the scene, and I haven't really seen anything yet, so I definitely want to come back and check out some of those bars and some of those great American whiskies.
Tell me about this whiskey that you bottled from an unnamed distillery somewhere in New South Wales.
Yes, so I've got a cask which is just over 2 years old, It's a 100-litre sherry cask, and yes, I bought spirit from a distillery in New South Wales. Not a lot of distillers around, and for them, for me, it was fantastic because up until then, no one would sell new make spirit. So to be able to buy new make spirit for them was fantastic because it put me on my road from independent bottling to now distilling, and where I go beyond, who knows. And it is just a one-man small operation.
Unfortunately, you won't be able to try that bottling until the end of the year, when Crafty plans to release it, along with a second bottling that sounds very intriguing. It's an ex-Lagavulin cask that was then used for Australian Muscat wine. And, by the way, I did try Crafty's new make spirit. Even though he's only been distilling for 3 weeks, it's really, really good. And that's this week's WhiskyCast In-Depth, brought to you by Lagavulin, the legendary Islay single malt. You'll find the classic 16-year-old, the Distillers Edition, and the new 8-year-old Lagavulin at a whiskey shop near you. Find out more at malts.com. The What I'm Tasting This Week department is brought to you by Heaven Hill Distillery. And let's start off with one of the Lime Burners single malts that Cameron Syme mentioned. Darkest Winter is a peated whiskey using Australian peat, and it's bottled at 64% ABV. The nose is peaty and medicinal with honey and vanilla notes in the background. The taste is thick and slightly tart at first, followed by a powerful burst of peat smoke and cinnamon, with honey and vanilla adding consistency and balance in the background. The finish is long and smoky with a lingering spiciness, and I'm scoring the Lime Burners Darkest Winter an 87. Now, let's look at the Starward wine cask, single malt from Starward Distillery in Melbourne, Victoria. It's matured completely in Australian wine casks and bottled at 41% ABV. As you might expect, the nose has notes of red grapes, fresh berries, and muted spices. The taste is fruity and tart with a subtle spicy bite that develops slowly and creates a nice complexity with notes of raspberries, strawberries, red grapes, and hints of allspice, licorice, and figs in the background. The finish is long and fruity with hints of licorice, and I'm scoring the Starward wine cask single malt an 89. I'll have more tasting notes in just a minute, but first, this week's tasting notes are brought to you by Heaven Hill Distillery, who is proud to announce the release of a new series of Old Fitzgerald bottled in bond bourbons. Bottled in an ornate decanter inspired by a 1950s original, it carries on the legacy of John E. Fitzgerald and his act of larceny. Learn more at blog.heavenhilldistillery.com. And think wisely, drink wisely. During the news, I mentioned the latest release from Compass Box. Hedonism The Muse is a blended grain Scotch whiskey made from whiskeys ranging between 17 and 43 years old. It's bottled at 53.5% ABV. The nose has notes of fresh fruits, honey, berries, a hint of oak, and soft spices. The taste is fruity and tart with notes of citrus fruits, fresh berries, ginger root, and hints of honey and vanilla. The finish is long, tart, vibrant, and luscious. It's excellent, and I'm scoring Compass Box's Hedonism The Muse a 93. Of course, I'm here in Waco, Texas this weekend for the debut of the first rye whiskeys from Balcones. And as we discussed with Jared Himstedt earlier, there are two versions, the 100 proof and the distillery exclusive Cask Strength Edition. The 100 proof is a 15-month-old rye bottled at 50% ABV, and the nose has notes of toasted bread with honey, subtle spices, and hints of molasses and chocolate in the background. The taste is spicy and powerful with clove, caramel apples, creme brulee, and honey, and that spiciness fades quickly, leaving behind a very sweet flavor with hints of milk chocolate. The finish is long and sweet, and for 15 months old, this whiskey has a very nice complexity. I'm scoring the Balcones Rye 100 proof an 89, and I'll have my tasting notes for the Cask Strength Edition coming up soon at whiskycast.com. The What I'm Tasting This Week department is brought to you by Heaven Hill Distillery. I'll be adding these tasting notes to our searchable list of nearly 2,100 different whiskeys at whiskycast.com. That's also where you'll find links for the WhiskyCast Tasting Panel podcast and our WhiskyCast HD video episodes, along with the latest whiskey news, events, and a lot more, including a complete archive of our past episodes. I want to thank everyone who has posted ratings and reviews for WhiskyCast at wherever you download your podcasts from over the past few weeks. When you do that, it really does make it easier for other whiskey lovers to find WhiskyCast when they're looking for content online. Once again, I'd like to thank the folks at Balcones Distillery here in Waco, Texas for their hospitality this weekend. And just a reminder, WhiskyCast retains full editorial control over the content of every episode. Of course, our cask strength conversation continues all week long online. You can connect with us on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and Tumblr at WhiskyCast. My email address is comments@whiskycast.com.
You don't need a special occasion to celebrate with something truly unique, but a personally engraved bottle of Johnnie Walker Blue Label can make any occasion special. Support for WhiskyCast comes from Johnnie Walker. Visit johnniewalker.com to find out more about engraving options near you.
WhiskyCast. Brought to you by Redbreast, the definitive single pot still Irish whiskey. Those in the know Redbreast.
WhiskyCast is a production of Cask Strength Media, copyright 2018. And comes to you most weeks from the charming, yet regrettably dry town of Haddonfield, New Jersey. This week I'm at Balcones Distillery in Waco, Texas, and next time around I'll be in Dublin, Ireland. It's a busy month. And I'm Mark Gillespie, reminding you that when you drink, please drink responsibly. Thanks for listening.